Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. Today we're talking portrait lenses. What is a portrait lens? Is there a portrait lens? Well, good thing that we have Sony Artisan of Imagery, Tony Gale here to guide us through this ambiguous topic. Tony, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here as always.
Always great to have you on. And look, we've been doing this a while now. You guys know Tony probably better than you know me. So I'm going to turn it over to him, but invite you, of course, to ask any of your questions. Joining us over on YouTube, just drop it into the comments section there, and we will get it relayed to Tony. Tony, I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I am a Sony Artisan of Imagery. And of course, thank you to Sony and to the B&H Event Space for having me, because without them, I'm not here. So let's talk portrait lenses. Before we really get started, let's just, for those who don't know who I am, I'm Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. I am a commercial photographer based here in New York City. Although I'm not in New York at the moment, as you could probably guess from my background. I shoot a combination of editorial, corporate, and advertising. Also coming up, I have several things coming up, but what we actually have on the site, there's a Central Park Waterfalls photo walk. I've done it several times. For those of you who live in New York or nearby and don't realize that there's waterfalls in Central Park, there are, and they're cool. That's July 23rd. July 29th, I'm going to be doing a presentation on the Sony Alpha 9 III, which is a truly amazing, groundbreaking camera. There's also a ton of cool stuff coming up on the B&H event space that doesn't involve me and involves other great people. Gene Fruth and Monica Sigmund are next Monday. Autumn Schrock, Chris Orwig. Really a bunch of great stuff. All free. Price is right. Also, I'd like to mention Sony's Alpha Universe website, a great resource to learn about photography, learn about Sony. Whether or not you shoot with Sony, you can learn great stuff. There's also the Alpha Universe forums, which is available through alphauniverse.com. It's a good place to ask questions, share your work, anything like that. It's very welcoming. I have yet to see anything mean posted. Maybe it's just removed, but it's a good community, very friendly, and it's free. There's also the Sony Alpha Female Plus program. Every week, they give away a $500 micro grant to someone who's entered a picture following the rules. I don't know what the rules are via the Facebook group. You do not need to use Sony cameras to be a member of the group. And I don't think you need to use Sony cameras to win. You also don't have to identify as female to be a member of the group or to win. Also a very friendly, welcoming group. One of the things I mention a lot in these presentations is that we are in an exciting time to be photographers. If for no other reason than the technology that's available to us allows us to experiment and learn so much faster than we ever could have when it was film. The lenses are so much better, cameras are so much better, autofocus is so much better, everything is so much better. One last thing before we really start, the Sony Alpha Pro Support Program. If you use Sony cameras and you have 2 full-frame cameras and 3 lenses that fit the criteria, you can join. It's $100 a year. It gets you discounts on repairs. It gets you free cleaning checks, gets you loaners. It's a really good program. I think it's absolutely worth $100 a year, even just for the cleaning checks. And all of that information is available at alphauniverse.com as well. All right, so let's talk portrait lenses. Derek asked the question before we started, what is a portrait? So I Googled it. Portraits are artistic representations of people, or an artwork that tells a person's story, or a blend of art history and biography, or a painting, photograph, sculpture, or other artistic representation of a person. To me, a portrait is a picture of a person that is about the person. That's what a portrait is to me. So a photograph that is about the clothing, that's what makes it fashion, for example, or the accessory. A photograph that is about the activity would be lifestyle. Here's someone making coffee. Maybe that's a lifestyle picture. You know, here's somebody fishing, lifestyle picture. Here's someone who happens to be fishing, but it's about that person, portrait. And of course, this definition is what I think of it as a portrait. This is the definition to me. It is for sure something that different people will differ in their opinions on. Some people feel very, very strongly, as is the case with everything in photography, about whatever particular definition they subscribe to. That's great. More power to you. A portrait being a picture of a person that is about the person is the definition to me. And there's even things like Peggy Sirota, a really successful celebrity photographer, did a whole book of portraits of celebrities where you couldn't see their faces, but it was still portraits because it was still about those people. So what is a portrait lens? There's a lot of lenses out there. Which ones are portrait lenses? Fundamentally, if you take a picture of a person that is about that person with a lens, it's a portrait lens, right? There are, and we'll discuss it, lenses that are more traditional portrait lenses, but any lens could be a portrait lens. That's not a great answer. Let's talk about field of view, distance from subject, depth of field, and primer zooms, and then we'll get into specific lenses. So field of view, is it a full frame or APS-C camera? And is it a full frame or APS-C lens? If you are using Sony cameras and lenses, you can put your APS-C lens on your full frame camera. What that will do, unless you turn it off, is automatically crop your full frame camera to become an APS-C crop. You can, of course, put your full frame lens on your APS-C camera as well. It's still going to be APS-C. So you have your field of view conversion, which with Sony APS-C is 1.5. So an APS-C lens times 1.5 equals the equivalent field of view of a full frame lens. One thing that's important is field of view is one thing, depth of field also isn't really equivalent. So shooting at, say, 2.8 on an APS-C lens gives you, say, an APS-C 50 millimeter lens, which is equivalent to a full frame 75 millimeter lens. If you shoot at 2.8 on both of them, the depth of field isn't going to be quite the same, but we're going to sidestep that for now. So if you have a 24 millimeter lens on an APS-C camera, or it is 36 millimeters equivalent on full frame, 50 is 75, 100 is 150. Most of the time today, I'm going to be talking about full frame because that's primarily what I use. But if you use APS-C, you can bear that in mind. So if I talk about a 100 millimeter lens, oh boy, I picked a complicated one, then APS-C would be 66.6 millimeters to get the equivalent of a 100 millimeter full frame lens. Traditionally, a portrait lens is anything between 70 millimeters and 135 millimeters on full frame, or between 50 and 85 on APS-C. Although, as I said at the beginning, it doesn't have to be limited to that range, and there are real reasons to not use those. But for a typical, head and shoulders type portrait, between 70 and 135 is going to do a good job at being flattering and a good choice. So, for example, we have 12 millimeters, 16, 21, 24, 35, 50, 70, 100, 135, 200, 300, 400. You can see here, 12 millimeters, probably not the right choice for a tight portrait. 16, still wide. 21, still wide. 24, still wide. I feel like at 35, it's starting to get okay-ish. 50, not bad, but 70, 100, 135, and up, I think is much more flattering. And I have used, as you'll see, 400 millimeter lens for portraits. But this gives you a sense of it. Aside from how flattering it is for the person, if you look in the background on those first two, the 12 and the 16, you can see the edge of the seamless. You can see a little bit of the room. Because the field of view is so wide, when I get close enough to get this type portrait, I'm still seeing much more of the background than I would typically want to see. One of the advantages of a longer lens is your background is compressed, so you don't have to worry about cleaning it up so much or seeing extraneous stuff like the sprinkler pipe on the ceiling. So this is in studio. What about outside? Here you can really see the difference in field of view. So 12, 14, 16, 21, 24, 35, 50, 70, 100, 135, 200, 300, 400, 800. All of these, by the way, are uncropped. There's a little bit of variation in the size of the head because I did sometimes a better job than others at maintaining that consistency. But same thing here. I think once you get to 35 millimeters, you're starting to see a more flattering, maybe more acceptable portrait length. But 70, 100, 135, 200, it starts to get a lot better. And as we said before, if you look at the difference between, say, 12 millimeters and 800 millimeters, you're seeing so much more information in the background at 12 millimeters compared to 800 that at 12 millimeters, it's very distracting often. Now, if you're doing an environmental portrait, if you want that environment, if you want to see more information back there, then it becomes a calculus, right? 800 for an environmental portrait is much too long. It's probably too long for anything. I was standing in the crosswalk really far away from him to get that. So finding that balance between how much information is in the back and what you want to see really comes into play. You can also see the depth of field changes with a longer lens compared to a shorter lens. So that comes into play. And then just for kicks, APS-C, same thing, 12, 14, 16, 18, 21, 24, 35, 50, 70, 100, 135, 200, 400, 600, and 800. Very much a similar effect, but you can see the 12 millimeters with the APS-C is less wide than the 12 millimeters was with full frame because it's that crop. And here to compare a little bit, 12 millimeters on the left, 35, second from the left, 70, 135. On APS-C, because you've got that crop factor, that wider lens isn't quite so wide, so it's a little more flattering. But on full frame, it's pretty much the same. You know, unless you're going in for an effect, you're probably not going to use 12 millimeters for portraits much. We also have distance from subject. So sometimes with a portrait, we're limited by the amount of space we have, especially if you're shooting inside. You may want to use that 200 millimeter lens, but you may not be able to get far enough back. So here you can see 135 on the left, 105, 85, 70, 50, 35, 24 millimeters. It's a little hard to see, but the next slide, it'll be a little closer. The top is the picture I took. The bottom is with me and the camera in the position it was. So you can see on the left with the 135, the camera is much further away. The 24 millimeter on the far right, the camera is actually, the front leg is on the deck and one of the other legs is on the stair to get that framing and to get that close. And of course, if you look at the depth of field difference between the 135 and the 24 millimeters, it's huge, although that 135 was shot at 1.8. The 105 was f4. Everything 105 to 24 was the same lens. It was a 24 105 f4G and all at f4, so you can see the difference in depth of field. And to get a better sense of it, 135 on the left, 24 millimeters on the right. So why this matters, maybe you have the space to shoot with a long lens, maybe you don't. If you need to shoot full frame and you're in a small room, you're probably not going to be able to use a 135. But also you run into situations too where you have either communication with who you're photographing. So maybe if you're too far away, it's hard to have that rapport. But conversely, you also don't necessarily want to be right on top of someone. Someone you're photographing may not be comfortable with you as a photographer if you're as close as that camera is to me with the 24 millimeters. They may be a little uncomfortable because you're right there. So thinking about that, what that distance means and what makes sense for the person and the space really comes into play. And then of course, depth of field. So when you're making a lens choice, how you like to shoot and what you're shooting and what the depth of field is comes into play. This was done with a 2470 2.8 G Master 2 at 70 millimeters at 2.8. You can see the eyes are sharp, the ears and the hair in the back is soft. I like to shoot that way. I like to shoot that shallow depth of field. It's reminiscent to me of the back in the day when we could shoot 4x5 portraits and get that really shallow depth of field. However, it's not the right choice for everyone. It's not the right choice for every shoot I do. And if you're photographing, say, multiple people or you want information in the background, then 2.8 isn't the answer. Or 1.2 or 1.8 or whatever. So thinking about a portrait lens, think about how you take pictures, what kinds of pictures you like to create. And that could come into play because the 2470 2.8 G Master, maybe you don't need the 2.8. Maybe the 24-105 f4 is a better answer because you're never going to shoot at 2.8. There's also the question of primer zooms. So you look at this, we've got the 2470 2.8 GM2 on the left. We've got the 51.2 GM on the right. Both lenses I own, both lenses I use and love. The 2470 is $2,300 currently. The 51.2 is $2,000. The 51.2 does one thing. It shoots at 50 millimeters. The 2470 can shoot everywhere from 24 to 70, including 50. So it's more versatile, probably, but it doesn't open up to 1.2. So what is the answer for you? It depends. And that's the case with every zoom lens. A zoom lens is going to give you more versatility. A prime lens is typically going to be a faster lens. So if I need to shoot in low light, the 1.2 is going to be huge. So 2.8 to 2, that's 1 stops. 2 to 1.4 is 2 stops. 1.4 to 1.2 is half a stop. So I could handhold the 50 at 2.5 stops slower, with 2.5 stops less light than the 2470 at the equivalent focal length. And that can be a really big deal if you're photographing in low light situations. So maybe the 50 is the right answer. Maybe the zoom is the right answer. I'm going to show examples of all of this. But that's the case with all lenses, zoom or prime. Everything's a trade-off. However, I will say there was a time not that long ago when zoom lenses just weren't as sharp as prime lenses. If you wanted sharpness, you went with prime. If you wanted versatility, you went with zooms. The lenses now, especially the G Masters, are so good and so sharp that I think it's a non-issue. I don't have any hesitation using zoom lenses any longer. And there was a time that I did. Primes are great, and I use a ton of those too, but zooms are also great. Let's also think about looking at similar lenses. So currently, Sony has 4 70 to 200 lenses. There's a 70 to 200 2.8 GM2. There's a 70 to 400 f4 macro G. There's the 70 to 200 2.8 GM1, and there's the 70 to 200 f4 G. So there's 4 70 to 200 lenses, $1,200 to $2,800. Which one makes sense for you? But just like anything, it depends. But the 70 to 200 2.8 GM2, super fast to focus, super sharp. I originally had the 70 to 200 f4G lens on one on the far right. When that lens came out, I bought it immediately. And it was a great lens. I loved having it. When the 70 to 200 2.8 GM2 came out, I bought that one instead because part of my reluctance to use a 2.8 zoom at that range was that it was heavier, bigger and heavier. And I liked the compact size and weight of the 70 to 200 f4G. However, one of the great things Sony's done with their GM2 lenses is, in particular, the 70 to 200 and the 2470, is they're much, much lighter and smaller than the previous versions. So I switched to the 70 to 200 2.8 GM2, great lens. That said, the 70 to 200 f4 G OSS2, the macro, super sharp. It is still lighter and smaller than the 70 to 200 2.8. It's macro, so it can focus much closer. Then you have the 70 to 200 2.8 GM, the original one. Obviously, if you can, I would always go with the newest lens. So I would go with the OSS, the GM2 if you can. But if you need the 2.8 and you can't swing that, still a great lens. And the 70 to 200 f4, just because a newer lens comes out that's better doesn't make it not good. Still a great lens. Then you also have the situation, you can look at the weight difference. So the GM2, 2.3 pounds, the macro f4, 1.7, the GM1, 3.3 pounds. You can see it lost a pound, it lost almost a third of its weight. And then the 70 to 200, the first one, the F4G, 1.8 pounds. So what matters? Focusing speed. If you want focusing speed, the GM2 is probably the answer. If weight is the answer, the macro G, the F4 is probably the answer. It's 1.7 pounds. There's a million different things that come into play, and there's as many different concerns as there are photographers. So what makes sense to you is what makes sense to you. I can't tell you this is the right one or that's the wrong one. There are obviously for specific things, reasons why one or the other is better, but you have to look at all of these specs. It's not just that something is more expensive or less expensive or newer or older. There's a million different things. So even if you look, the macro focuses at 10.2 inches. The GM2 focuses at 15.7 inches. The original F4 is 3.3 feet, and the original GM 3.15 feet. So the two newer lenses focus much closer, if that's a concern for you. A newer lens is almost always going to focus faster, if that's a concern for you. All right, so there's a ton of things people always say, or people frequently say, what lens should I buy for whatever? The answer is always, of course, it depends. So I'm going to show a bunch of examples of portraits taken with specific lenses that I own. Then I'll mention a couple lenses I don't own at the end. So let's look at some actual portraits with some of the lenses I use. Starting with the 2470 2.8 GM2. I also owned the 2470 2.8 GM, the original one. Prior to that, I had the 2470 F4 Sony Zeiss. As each newer one came out, I switched to the newer one. The 2470 2.8 GM2 is an incredible lens. Part of the advantage of that zoom, we talked about that versatility, is I can shoot at 24 millimeters. And while you saw that 24 millimeters on a close-up portrait is not very flattering, when you're trying to get the space, it can work much better. I don't think anybody would look at this and think he is distorted or unflattering in any way. It's because he's smaller in the frame, the distortion, it really doesn't exist. I can also shoot at 70 millimeters. If I'm going to shoot tight, I prefer a little longer, but 70 millimeters does the trick. This was in Central Park. I was experimenting with a split diopter filter. It turns out that one I bought is not very good, so it didn't work as the way a split diopter should, which is to allow you to have two planes of focus, but it did do this cool blurry half frame thing. So I tried playing around with that instead. Originally, I had two people. They were each going to be in a different plane of focus, and it was just the blurry side was blurry no matter what I did. So instead, I did this, which I thought was fun. And again, the versatility, 70 millimeters on the left, 24 millimeters on the right. If you're in a situation where you need to do a lot of things quickly, which I frequently am, I need to photograph somebody tight, half length, full length, horizontal, vertical, all this stuff. A zoom really, really is helpful. I don't have to take the time to switch lenses. If I'm in a situation where I do need to switch lenses a lot, I'll usually just use two different cameras. So one camera will have one lens and another camera will have another lens, because that's faster than switching. You also, if you're in the field and switching a lot, you might get dust on your sensor and not notice, and then you've got 500 frames you have to remove the dust on, which is annoying. But the versatility 2470 is hard to beat. 51 millimeters on the left, 70 millimeters on the right. 42 millimeters. That's also something about zooms, is nobody makes a 42 millimeter lens. You know, nobody makes a 51 millimeter lens. I have a 50, I have a 55. So sometimes the focal length you need, that exact focal length, doesn't exist in a prime lens. Obviously, you can move forward or back as long as you have the space, but it is nice to have that versatility. Manhattan, 41 millimeters. My daughter, 34 millimeters. 57 millimeters in studio. 24 millimeters at the Sony condo trip last year. So 2470 2.8 G Master 2, great lens. Although I'm not, every lens I own I love. So 24-105 f4G. This I think is a very underrated lens. I think this lens, if you're only going to own one Sony full frame lens, could be the lens for you. 24-105 is a lot of versatility. I prefer that extra 35 millimeters at the long end, that 70-105 for type portraits I really like. Even though here we are at 43 millimeters. My daughter in the driveway, the Alpha 9.3. That Alpha 9.3 is magic with that global shutter, being able to shoot with strobe 3200 of a second. 47 millimeters, 105. So again, here, the 105 millimeters, to me, I really, really like that, having that extra range. It's just a little more flattering. It's a focal length I prefer. But I still use probably the 2470 more than anything. So there you go. 105 millimeters again. 105 again. And then I mentioned the original 2470 2.8 GM and the 2470 f4 Sony Zeiss. Both lenses I've used. This is the original G Master, original G Master, original G Master, and the Sony Zeiss. This with the Sony Zeiss was ended up being a magazine cover, back with the Alpha 7 R2, which is the camera that made me go full-time mirrorless. So there's a range of, that's what's called a standard zoom, that 24 to 70-ish, 24 to 105-ish. The right answer for you is the right answer for you. The 70 to 200 2.8 GM2, I mentioned that a little bit in the comparison. Also a lens I love. I do a lot of corporate portraits, corporate headshots, and I use the 70 to 200 GM2 more than anything for that because it's always tighter. I'm not going to show any of that work because it's just not that interesting, but it's a great versatile lens if you're doing headshots, for example. Here we are at 136 millimeters in studio, 84 millimeters, 70 millimeters. So conversely, even though I often wish I had a little bit more range at the top end with the 2470, here I am all the way down at 70 with the 70 to 200. But this is a 3/4 portrait. I really, that 70 to 200 2.8 GM2, great lens. And again, if you're primarily a headshot person, it's really worth considering, or if you have a lot of space. So the 51.2, here we are, we're breaking out of the standard portrait range, right? The 70 to 135-ish range. 51.2 GM, great lens. Here we are at f2. So f2, to get that depth of field, that's not something I can do with the zooms because they don't go down to f2, they're at 2.8. f2 again, Times Square. 1.8. 1.2. So that 1.2 really does a great job at getting you that shallow depth of field. You know, she is not that far from that door in the background, but because I'm at 1.2, I can really throw it out of focus. It's a really, really beautiful bokeh. 1.2, shooting handheld, just with the available neon, not something that's going to be easy to do at 2.8 or f4. Obviously, you can boost the ISO, but because I'm old school, like to keep my ISO as low as possible. 1.2. And then all the way up at f8, just to mix it up. And you can see, I feel like, because it's tight, that you can feel a little bit, it's a little bit wide at 50. I still like the portrait, but it's a little wide. Then we have this Sony 85 1.8. This, I think, is one of the most overlooked lenses that Sony makes. 85 1.8, it's not a G or a G Master, which are the G and the G Master signify better weather sealing, usually faster autofocus. They're pro level lenses. The 85 1.8 is just the 85 1.8, $600. I think this lens is a steal. I think it's one of the best bangs for your buck you can get. Great lens. So the 85 1.8, you can come in tight, beautiful focal length, really flattering. Here I am at f2, so you get that shallow depth of field look that I like so much. I know I'm not the only person who likes it. And I just saw somebody post on it, social media, that look is done. So who knows? And then, backing up on the right, it also allows you to get a very fast shutter speed because you can open up so much. 85-1.8, just beautiful lens. 85-1.8, you can focus nice and tight. Step back. Really an overlooked lens. If you're looking for a fast prime, you get a lot of bang for your buck with that 85-1.8. And here you can see, even at 2.8, the depth of field is so shallow that we're able to have her face sharp, but her foot in the leading edge is a little bit soft, which I think helps draw focus to her head, which is really what matters. Then we have the Sony 90 macro, super sharp lens, really great lens. It's a 2.8. It's older, so it's not going to focus as fast as like the 70-200 2.8 G Master 2, but a great lens. As I was going through trying to find pictures I photographed with different lenses, I know I've done a lot more with the 90 than I have here, but I'm not sure which shoots they were. This was at the Photo Expo back in the day. For those of you who don't know, B&H now has their Build Expo. The next one's in the spring, I think. I really loved the Photo Expo when it happened, when I moved to New York. My deadline to arrive in 2000 was to attend the Photo Plus Expo. So I'm thrilled that B&H does their Build Expo now to sort of carry on that torch. Super tight focusing, beautiful sharp lens, really, really tight focusing. The 90 is also an overlooked lens, I think, a great lens. The 100-400 G Master. So most people would argue that a 100-400 is overkill for portraits, but it's super sharp, focuses fast. It's not always going to be the answer. Again, you need the space. If you're somewhere tight, it's going to be too long, but it's a great lens. Nice sharp focus. And also, if you're doing portraits outside, the versatility becomes good. So this is out by Bethesda Fountain in New York City. But I don't think I would look at this picture and know it was New York City. But I was quite far away, 235 millimeters. It allowed me to get that out of focus railing in the foreground that just helps give it some depth. At 107 millimeters, full length, still quite far away. So the people that I wanted walking in front to get that blur, if I was closer with the shorter lens, those people would be like, what's going on? And usually I find people try and go around. But for something like this, where I wanted that motion in the foreground, I need a longer lens so that people don't notice I'm there and they don't try and help me by going around and not helping me. So 100-400 at 107, at 105. Sony 135 1.8 G Master. This is really, really a great lens. The only caveat is you need the space, right? 135 is pretty long. You saw at the beginning that 135 is the longest lens I showed with that camera in my position. If you're in a small space, it's probably going to be too tight, but if you have the space, beautiful lens. 1.8, that 1.8 with a 135 too, really great. This is just window light in a studio. Many of these self-portraits were a COVID project I did when I couldn't photograph other people at f4. 1.8 again. So you're getting that just sliver of sharp focus. The foreground's out of focus, the background's out of focus, and it helps draw attention to the subject and not get too distracting with all the other information there. At f2 in the studio. Again, I really like having that shallow depth of field and getting those out of focus foreground elements and background elements. Again, that super shallow depth of field, large format look. This was at Sony's condo trip last year as well. This was at a different Sony condo trip, I think 3. Also, just look at how thin this depth of field is, how shallow it is. For a tight portrait like this, to just have everything just sort of fade out of focus, I think it's beautiful. Then we have the 100 2.8 STF G Master. This lens is a very unusual lens. The STF is smooth transition focus. And what makes this lens unusual is it has basically an integrated neutral density. So if you're photographing at 2.8, it affects the bokeh. The bokeh is the nature of the out of focusness of a lens. So the background blur is bokeh. The STF affects how that bokeh is rendered. So it renders differently. It's smoother. But because of that integrated neutral density on the edges, it's a 2.8 lens. It's an f2.8, but the t-stop is 5.6. T-stop is the actual amount of light that comes in. F-stop is a formula relative to the sides of the lens opening and the focal length. So t-stop gives you the correct exposure. F-stop gives you information. Cinema lenses typically use t-stops. Still lenses usually use f-stops. So this is a 2.8, but the t-stop wide open is 5.6 because of that neutral density. So you're getting the depth of field of 2.8, but you need the light for 5.6. I know it's a little bit of a weird thing to explain, but it's a beautiful, beautiful lens, crazy sharp. Such a beautiful lens. So here we are, f5.6. I'm sorry. One thing is the metadata will say f5.6, even though it's actually f2.8. So it's really 2.8, but with the t-stop of 5.6. Same here. And here, if you look just at the way the out of focusness happens and how creamy it is, it's a beautiful lens. If you're never going to shoot wide open, and maybe it's not the right lens, although it is crazy sharp, but it's beautiful lens. I love this lens. Even here, you can see the back of his handkerchief, his neckerchief, just the way that fades back, and even his ears are starting to go soft. And then, just to mix things up, the 12-24 f4G. So normally, 12-24, not a portrait lens. At the beginning, I showed you the example of shooting super tight with the 12-24, and that's not a very flattering thing. That said, there are times when it really works. This is a self-portrait in Alaska a few years ago. The 12-24 was what was on my lens because I was doing this glacier cave tour. It's very useful for effect. So because of the distortion, it really gives you an exaggerated sense of depth. Same thing here. Here, I was in Florence at his workshop. He makes copper pots and pans that are beautiful. You can order them online. I don't remember the website, but if anybody really cares, email me and I'll send it to you. I had the 12-24 on because we were wandering the streets of this little town. But here, you got the whole sense of place. It really was a beautiful thing. And I'm gonna address a question just came in from Elizabeth Murphy. Can your settings that you post be used with any lens, not just Sony? Yes, absolutely. Whether or not you use Sony cameras, everything should still apply. I'm including the settings, but if you're using another brand, it's all the same. A 100mm lens on a Sony is the same as a 100mm lens on any other full frame camera. Obviously, the specific lens may be better or not, but a 100mm lens on Sony compared to anything else that's full frame should give you the same look. If you shoot at 2.8 with a 100mm lens, it should look very similar no matter what camera you're using, as long as it's full frame. If you're using APS-C, then you just have to do the lens conversion. But yes, absolutely. Oh, and the B&H Event Space staff just posted a link to the copper that you can buy online. It's great. If you're ever in Tuscany, you can go to the shop. He's very friendly. He doesn't seem friendly at first, but he is. You can go to the shop. It's fantastic. Elizabeth, I hope that answered your question. Here we are at the 1224 at about 16mm. I just realized I didn't include the focal lengths on these. This was about 16mm. I only know because I was looking at it this morning. But you really get a sense of place. You get that exaggerated effect. Because he's so small in the frame, he doesn't feel distorted. And then if you do want to do tight portraits and get that distortion, you'll notice at the beginning, everybody was straight towards camera. If you just have people turn their heads a little, it's still distorted, but it doesn't feel unflattering in the same way. But you do have the situation with the background. So here, the original on the left, and on the right, I just selected it in Photoshop and extended everything in the background. Same thing here. This was big in the 90s. People did a lot of that wide angle looking down look. Maybe it's come and gone since then again as well, but tons of tech companies in the 90s love this look. So there are times when that exaggerated effect really works. And then I'm just going to mention a few lenses that I haven't really used. I did use, I've used a couple of them a tiny bit, but I don't own them. So I can't speak to them, but I think they're worth looking at if you are looking at portrait lenses and the stuff I use hasn't resonated with you. The Sony 70-300 is a really nice focal length. I used it a little bit in Cuba. Somebody I was there with had one and I borrowed it a little. But 70-300, really great range if you want that whole expanse. The price is certainly right. I think it's worth looking at. The 85 1.4 G Master, super sharp lens. I know a lot of people who really, really, really love this lens. Whether this makes sense to you or the 1.8, it just depends. The 1.8 is much smaller and lighter. This has the 1.4 and it's a G Master, so the weather sealing is better and all of that. The 20-70 f4G is a lens I keep meaning to borrow and try because one of the things I find as a walking around lens that the 24-70 lacks is I often wish I had wider than 24. So the fact that this 20-70 exists is really cool. And because you've got 20, you can really do a lot with environmental portraits all the way to 70. And then if you're on APS-C, I think the 51.8 is a great lens to look at because it becomes effectively a 75mm on full frame. So it's a good alternative to an 85, because if you put an 85 on full frame, then it's more like a 135. It's a great lens to experiment with, I think. I've only used it a tiny bit, so I can't really speak to it, but it's something I would consider. And it comes in black and silver, so you can go with the color that you like. All right, let's see if there are any other questions.
We will open it up for questions. I'm going to start it. I don't want to back you into a corner, Tony, but
7.
Correct. Particularly with the 85, because I think that's where you generally see the difference. And a lot of people always ask, most of the time with an 85, you have a 1.2, a 1.4, a 1.8.
Yep.
What if you had to pick one of the three for most people, if we had to just go for you had to satisfy the most amount of people's needs at once, what do you think is the best bang for the buck on that 85?
85 1.8.
85 1.8?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to other brands because I don't know what they have and what the pricing is. But the Sony 85 1.8 at $600, you get so much bang for your buck. And it's tiny. It weighs nothing. It's a really overlooked great lens. Now that doesn't mean that the 85 1.4 G Master isn't a great lens. It's just I don't not everyone is the right person for the 85 1.4. Some people might think it's too heavy, for example. That is one of the challenges with faster lenses is there's just more glass, so it's heavier. Um, I think the 85 1.8 is a great lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point too. I smiled when you brought up the 20 to 70 f4 because way back when it was I had the choice of I need to get a 70 to 200, and it was either a 7200 2.8 or a 7200 f4. And my original mentor, who's shot tons of commercial jobs, magazine covers, album covers, he had the f4 version, and it was like everything you learned. Oh wow, 2.8 is better. This is the more professional model. And he's like, well, I either shoot in a studio and I have plenty of space and I have lighting, or I'm outside, so I don't need it. I don't need the extra stops. And
Yeah,
that forever changed my outlook on all of that because I feel like a lot of people get locked into what they think might be a better lens just because of specs or what all the information that floats around on the internet, I guess you could say, with keeping it pretty broad. But how often
some
do you,
of it is information.
information? Yeah, let's throw quotes around that. And it's like I look at the further I've gotten along, it's like you start to I'm shooting everything at 5.6, 6.3 f8. And it's like, okay, I'm using really shallow depth of field, probably minimally, and only when I really need to for just allowing more light into my camera. So it's interesting. You said you saw something on the internet that the shallow depth of field portrait might be going away, or maybe
Maybe.
trending for some people that way.
Well, that I saw something saying that. Now is you can say anything you want, and in 10 years we'll know if it was true.
Yeah.
Um, I still like it.
When do you find yourself, or let's ask why? Why do you, is it more for the look of shot?
It's
Like
the
for
look,
me,
yeah.
okay, okay,
There are times like those two portraits in Times Square at night. There are times when it's a utility thing,
okay.
just opening wide open so that I can keep that shutter speed high enough. Uh, but mostly it's the look. If it's a situation where I have any concern, I'm going to stop down a little just because it gives me more leeway.
Mhm.
Uh, there are times like if something's very backlit, for example, I might want to stop down to f4 just in case. Or if there's multiple people, if you shoot wide open, somebody's out of focus. That's something I see a lot, surprisingly a lot in like Facebook groups. Somebody will post that they did a group picture of 4 people and not everybody's sharp, and they'll post their settings and they photographed it f2 and they're not sure why the person in the back wasn't sharp. It's because it was f2. You need to be f5 6 f8 f11 depending on the group and the lens. So it just depends on what you do.
Yeah, definitely. And along with that, I think a lot of people don't understand sometimes the technical aspect of, yes, if you have everybody in a line, as you get further along the edges, the distance is increasing, and when you're going on focusing,
Yes.
cameras aren't using a brain that says, well, okay, they're all standing shoulder to shoulder, let's make them all in focus. It's all down to a mathematical equation and distance, and
Yeah, and yeah,
what
you're right. The
factor that in.
person, it's even the old school DSLR and film camera thing where you would focus and recompose.
Yeah,
You had that center point, you'd focus and then you'd recompose. Even doing that, if you were wide open, you could lose your focus because now the focus point isn't the same distance. And
yeah,
it's, I mean, that gets into nuances that you have to be nerdy enough to care about.
yeah. We
But
can talk about that for hours and hours on end.
there's also even the technical stuff. Sometimes you think you know it, you don't.
Mhm.
When I was early on, I did one of the first jobs I ever shot for money. I made $65 to photograph some futons for this guy who made futon frames.
Mhm.
And I knew that if you shot wide open, the depth of field was shallower. So I'm like, oh, it's okay that the background doesn't look that good because I'm going to shoot wide open. I didn't understand at the time that while that's true, that it's more out of focus because it was a wider lens, it wasn't going to be that far out of focus. And it looked
Yeah.
terrible. It looked terrible. Like the work I did for him, it was probably worth about $65. Um, but I thought I understood. I mean, I think that's an important thing, even now, to make sure that I don't, get over my skis and think that I understand something better than I actually do, because there's so much to know.
Yeah, definitely. One of the pictures I want to call out before we get to this next question is that I thought was a perfect example that you showed was the subject was sitting like on a couch and you had the knees, like the feet were slightly out of focus.
Yeah,
But it's even just something like that. It's not completely blown out. It's not like a huge, where you're using a super compressed lens or a super telephoto lens where there's really like a huge difference in what's in focus and what's out of focus. And I think even just that slightness in the out of focus can make such a huge difference in. I think we don't even realize it that we're drawn right into where we need to be drawn into the face, and you have everything there. It's more of an environmental, but it's just a nice soft fall off. And I think even that, like using restraint, is like that's what you're talking about. Like having that experience to know that's like, okay, if it's completely in focus, it might not hit the same way as if I have a slight fall off.
I agree. And when I talked about how it's a good time to be a photographer, it used to be that some cameras had the depth of field preview button. I don't know if you remember that. Film
Hmm.
cameras
Yeah.
might have a depth of field preview button so you could get a sense of it. But now, especially with mirrorless, you can see. I know how
Everything.
much is out of focus and how much is sharp. Like I don't have to guess. Uh, so you can really dial in what you want and experiment and try different things uh, without the hassle of shooting 5 rolls of film to try and get one picture.
Yeah, it definitely is a beautiful time to be a photographer. We have another question coming in from Visual Modulations joining us on YouTube. If I have the 90 macro, what would be the benefit of picking up an 85? Or would there?
So if you have the 90 macro, picking up the 85, if you were going to pick up another portrait lens, it probably wouldn't be the 85 to me. The 85 1.8, for example, is smaller and lighter than the 90 macro, and it's a stop and a third brighter. So if you're in a situation where you often wish that you could open up wider than 2.8, then the 85 1.8 might be the answer. But in terms of look, if you photograph both, if you take a picture of a person both at 2.8 with the 85 and the 90, I doubt that you'll be able to tell the difference. Like it's such a 5 millimeters at that range is not much. It's not like 12 to 17. Um, so if you were going to look at another portrait lens, I would look at something else entirely. The 135 or 70 to 200 or something like that.
And great time probably to call out that macro lenses, great portrait lenses. Great detail in macro lenses for those people who are not using macro lenses as portrait lenses or thinking macro lenses are just for insects. Super great portrait lenses, especially if for people who shoot like details like jewelry, for example, where you're photographing people with details, macro lenses. Another question here. We're going to throw out a situation. This question is more situational photo. Looks like a large group photo. Which lens would you recommend for a large group photo? I guess, for our viewers out there, we have to take into consideration large group. You're thinking wider, but if you go wide, the edge is.
Well, it depends on the situation. So generally, I think a 2470 is probably going to do it. That said, I had a situation recently. I was photographing a group of 50 people in an office,
Oof.
and I was up on a ladder because then you can get the depth. I started with the 2470 and it wasn't wide enough. Unfortunately, I had my 1635 f4 with me, so I used that. So it depends on the situation. I mean, 50 people is a lot. Most
Yeah,
group pictures aren't going to be that. I think for the most part, something like the 2470 is going to serve you well with that. You're going to be able to shoot both groups and single people pretty easily.
perfect. Well, Tony, huge thank you to you again. For those of you who maybe didn't think of a question, Tony dropped his email there. We have all of his socials. You can reach out to him there. He's always here on our platform. So you can also just wait for the next time we have him on. And we will be doing some in person. Tony Gale's in person photo walks and in person workshops that we're doing out on location have already started to pop up on the Event Space website. So keep an eye out for those. We'll be getting some more added. But if you do want to come out and learn in person and see how Tony does his thing live, which is usually a lot better and easier to learn when you're not just dropping slides on us.
Well, you can at least ask questions that I can answer and then ask the follow-up question and I can answer that too.
Yes, much
Well,
better. So
well, hopefully I can answer. We'll see.
his success rate, I think we got you over a 99.9% success rate on answering questions live.
All
Maybe.
right. If you say so.
We haven't fact checked it, but yes, we'll get those questions asked. It is a great experience if you guys are in the tri-state area or going to be in the New York area during one of our in-person events. It is, if you haven't been, it's a great time to do it. As Tony said, you get to ask questions, ask follow-ups, and really get hands-on. We do invite you to bring your cameras out and photograph for yourselves. So
Even if
e-
you don't use Sony,
even if you don't use Sony, yes. And, since we're there, even if you don't have a camera or don't feel like bringing the camera out that day,
sometimes people bring their phones.
that's it. You photograph with your phone. Tony actually does some of the walks that you do, Tony. You can just come and hang out. I mean, we do the Central Park waterfalls. I
Yeah.
go and I hang out. It's a nice day
Yeah.
to get out of the office. So
You get reminded that there are waterfalls in Central Park.
I forget every time until this time of year. I spend all my time in the Great Lawn. It's good to get out and see a different part of it. So
Less crowded than the lawn.
much less crowded. If you guys haven't explored Central Park, that's a great one to go to. I think we have Prospect Park coming up. Or did we do Prospect Park this
I
time?
think
We going
I think we did.
I think we have Prospect Park, East Side. We got a nice little mix of
Yeah.
locations coming up. So check the website for those. Like I said, we do have some up already. The rest will be adding in due time. But that is all we have for now. Huge thank you to Tony, as always, for bringing his expertise here to the B&H Event Space and to Sony for hosting, to all of you for tuning in. That's all we got for you right now. Another edition of the B&H Event Space, and now in the books.
Thanks,
Catch
everybody.
y'all next time.